"Well," Court declared with curious calm, "it's simply this. I have reason to believe that the Earth is going to be destroyed. Wait a minute," he cried hastily. "Perhaps I shouldn't have mentioned this till I was absolutely certain, but I want to talk to someone." His unrealized loneliness showed naked for an unguarded second on his face. He caught himself and was once more impassive. "The Earth is going to face a plague that will destroy civilization. Of that, at least, I am certain." "A plague," she breathed. "I call it that, for lack of a better term. Every being on this planet will be affected by it." Marion looked at him sharply. Her lovely eyes narrowed. "Affected? Don't you mean destroyed?" Court pushed back his chair and rose. "No," he whispered, "I don't." His grave lips went hard. "Come here, Marion. Look at this." He strode to a safe in the wall, opened it, and withdrew a small oblong box of lead. Set in one face was a round, transparent disk. "Look through the lens," he commanded. "Don't get too close to that thing, though." Marion obeyed. Through the tiny pane she could see within the box a shining lump of matter, no larger than the nail of her thumb. "It's phosphorescent," she said. "What is it, an ore?" "A specimen of flesh, taken from the thigh of a man named Pierre Losicaud, a French-Canadian." "Flesh?" The girl peered again at the object. "Was he exposed to radium?" Court replaced the box in the safe. "No, nothing like that. Losicaud lived in a little settlement in a valley in the wilderness. A month ago he staggered into the nearest town, emaciated and nearly dead. His story was just about unbelievable. He claimed that one day a heavy fog, abnormally heavy, blanketed his valley and affected the inhabitants peculiarly. They became incredibly hungry, ate enormous meals, their skin became hot to the point of high fever, and they grew so old that most of them died. Losicaud went for help, but nobody recognized him when he arrived in town. He looked 30 years older. What does that suggest to you, Marion?" "Increased metabolism," she said unhesitatingly. "Exactly. A rescue party was sent out. They found the corpses of a dozen old men and women in the valley, but no sign of what killed them. There was no sign of a fog or anything dangerous. Meanwhile, Losicaud was luckily put into an isolation ward in the hospital. He ate tremendously. It was noticed that his skin emitted radiation. In the dark, his body actually shone." Court lit a cigarette for a few abstracted puffs before continuing. "His nurse caught the contagion. She killed herself. Losicaud is kept in utter isolation now, for there isn't a doctor or a nurse who dares to get near him. When Dr. Granger wired me, I suggested lead insulation so he could obtain his specimen for me to study. I want to see Losicaud and make further experiments upon him." Marion frowned. "You have other evidence, of course?" "Naturally. Similar cases have been reported to me. This isn't anything new. Do you remember, about 7 years ago, a newspaper story about a valley in France where the inhabitants were killed by a heavy fog? It was attributed to poison gas. Do you remember that West Indian island where life was wiped out overnight, without any explanation at all? People talked about volcanic gas. My files are full of apparently meaningless items like that. Freaks and sports born to animals and humans. So-called ghost stories about apparitions that shone in the dark. There are dozens of other examples." The girl shuddered as she thought of the tag of flesh she had seen. "And do you think this is the beginning of a plague?" "My graphs and charts show an upward swing. These occurrences happen more frequently as time goes on. Whatever causes them is growing more powerful." "But what could cause such a thing?" the girl asked. "No virus could." "Not a virus. Filterable or not, they could not cause cellular radioactivity. This menace, this unknown X, is certainly not a virus. I don't know its nature, nor where it comes from. Till I know those factors, I can do nothing." "Could it be a weapon of war?" Marion suggested. "You mean— well, scarcely. Once it's started, it's completely uncontrollable. X isn't man-made, for its record goes back too far for chemistry. It's a natural phenomenon, and our only clue is fog." "A gas?" Cort nodded, and his eyes grew distant with thought. "Where does it come from? Under the earth? That's possible, of course, but hardly any of these cases have occurred in volcanic country. I think X comes from the interstellar void." Marion's eyes widened in horrified recollection. "That's why you've been getting those observatory reports, photographs and spectra." Cort grunted impatiently. "They showed nothing, and that's what I can't understand." "Maybe the conditions aren't right," Marion suggested. "Phosphorescence isn't visible in daylight. Perhaps X isn't visible in space." Cort didn't move, but his fingers broke his cigarette in two. "What was that?" he demanded, startled. Before the girl could reply, he whistled sharply and turned to the window. "Of course! A catalyst! Some element in our atmosphere makes X visible, and perhaps dangerous as well. In outer space it can't be seen, but when it comes in contact with some element in the air, I think you've got it, Marion." He stared grimly at the dark sky. "Up there, yet it's invisible. Perhaps a cosmically huge cloud of it is drifting eternally through space. We're probably on the outer fringes, so we've touched only a few tiny, scattered wisps. When Earth plunges into the main body—" Cort lifted a clenched fist, furious because he was such a tiny, insignificant figure against the mighty concourse of the starry void. "An element so alien that we can scarcely conceive of it. We can realize it exists only by seeing its effects on Earth. What is it? What physical laws govern that frightful matter? Or is it matter as we know it?" He turned suddenly, his eyes hard and determined. "We're leaving for Canada. Charter a plane. I'll pack the equipment I need." Marion paused at the door. "Mr. Cort," she began, and hesitated. "Well?" Somehow, though, she could find no words. In her mind was the picture of Cort at the window, challenging the universe. A champion of mankind, he had made a magnificent gesture. But then Marion saw his cold, grim eyes. Reading the expression in them, her face whitened as she realized suddenly that Cort cared nothing at all for mankind. His motives were passionlessly selfish. He was not a champion. He was a scientist, cold, calculating, egocentric, challenging an opponent that threatened his existence. Whatever she meant to say died in her throat, just as something died in her heart. She went out of the room and closed the door quietly behind her. Chapter 5. Jansaya. It was dark in the forest, though sunlight filtered down wanly through the branches. Truly, the earth had changed since Ardath had first set foot upon it. He was not entirely pleased as he strode along, matching step with the gigantic Thordred. It did not seem to him that this world would be a suitable dwelling-place. Thousands of years had passed since Ardath had taken Thordred from his home. Weary centuries had passed in ageless slumber, and a new civilization had risen. But somehow Ardath did not feel at home in this time. He sensed a subtle strangeness in the very air about him. He sighed a little wearily. His plans had gone amiss. The death of Zaina, the Amazon Queen, had taken him by surprise. He had hoped to retain her as a mate for Thordred, but without apparent cause the woman's sleep had changed to death. A fleeting